The morning my brother drove his truck through the front of my flower shop, he left the engine running. I know that detail because the responding officer mentioned it in her notes, and because my assistant Poppy, who had arrived 40 minutes before I did, told me she could still smell the exhaust when she walked up to the building. She had called me 3 times before I picked up. I was at the wholesale flower market on the other side of the city, standing in the cold storage aisle between 2 buckets of ranunculus, and when I finally answered, she didn't say anything for a moment. That pause told me more than the words that came after it. My shop was called Wren & Soil. I had opened 22 months earlier on a street corner in the Caldwell district, in a space that had previously been a dry cleaner, and before that, apparently, a shoe repair shop. There were still bolt holes in the concrete floor where old equipment had been anchored. I left them. They became part of the aesthetic, which was something I was not embarrassed to care about. I was 31 years old when I signed the lease. I had spent the previous 8 years working as a production coordinator for a regional event company, and before that 2 years as a floral assistant at a hotel banquet operation, where I learned more about volume buying and cold chain logistics than I ever learned about flowers themselves. The $67,000 I used to open Wren & Soil came from 8 years of saving, one small inheritance from my grandmother's estate, and a personal loan from a credit union that required 18 months of financial documentation before they approved it. Nobody co-signed anything. I did not ask anyone to. The build-out took 11 weeks. I stripped the drywall myself on 3 consecutive weekends with a borrowed crowbar and a dust mask that was not adequate for the job. I sourced the antique brass fixtures from an estate sale 2 counties over. I found a local ceramicist who made the custom vases that lined the window ledge and agreed to a consignment arrangement that worked for both of us. I painted the exterior a color I had been thinking about for 2 years, a deep eucalyptus green that I had to have custom mixed at the paint store because nothing off the shelf was exactly right. The sign above the door I had hand-lettered by a calligrapher I found through a mutual friend. Her name was June and she worked slowly and charged accordingly, and it was worth every cent. I named the shop Wren & Soil because wrens build their nests in the unlikeliest places and because soil is where things begin before anyone can see them. Both of those things meant something specific to me that I did not feel the need to explain to anyone. My family had a particular way of functioning. From the outside, it resembled support. From the inside, once you knew how to read it, it was something more like a ledger. My parents, Kenneth and Dorothy, had 2 children. I was the older one. My brother Lyle was 4 years younger and had been since birth the family's primary project. I do not say that bitterly. I say it because it is accurate and because understanding it is necessary for understanding everything else. The accounting, if you wanted to do it, was not difficult. My parents had covered Lyle's rent twice when he lost jobs, once for 7 months and once for 4. They had paid off a credit card balance in the neighborhood of $18,000 after what my mother referred to as his difficult year. When he totaled a truck in a situation that was not fully covered by his insurance, they bought him another one. A Ford F-250, which is relevant. They had invested $40,000 in a landscaping business he started at 30, a business that operated for 14 months before he dissolved it, citing, in his words, market conditions. I had never asked my parents for money. When I was looking for a co-signer for the credit union loan, I had a brief conversation with my father. He said he wasn't comfortable putting his name on debt he couldn't control. I understood that. I found my own way. What I did not know was where the money for all of Lyle's expenses had been coming from, or that its source had terms attached to it. 14 months before the truck went through my window, Lyle came to Wren & Soil. He did not have an appointment. He showed up on a Tuesday afternoon in October, right at the beginning of the autumn wedding rush, which is the busiest I ever get. He walked around the shop for a few minutes without saying anything, looking at the ceramic vases and the brass fixtures and the custom cooler unit I had installed along the back wall. Then he sat down on the stool I keep near the design table and told me he had an idea. He wanted to use Wren & Soil as a base of operations for a landscaping and outdoor event styling venture he was relaunching. He needed storage space, access to my cooler, use of my supplier accounts, and what he called a nominal arrangement on the rent, because he was in a growth phase. He had brought a folder. There were printouts. He had thought about this. I told him no. He looked at the brass fixtures for a moment and then he said, in the particular tone he had always used for that particular kind of pressure, that our father had a good relationship with the owner of the building next door, whose lot my shop's only functional delivery access ran through by informal arrangement. He said it the way you say something that is technically just information. I told him the conversation was over and asked him to leave. He left without visible frustration, which was worse than if he had been angry. He left the way someone leaves when they have made a note. I should tell you about Poppy. She had been with me since month 3. Her full name was Poppy Vance, and she was 24 and had a background in botanical illustration and an instinct for arrangement that I recognized the first time I watched her work. She had 2 younger siblings she helped support, and she was the most reliable person I had ever employed, which is a low bar to clear in the events industry and a genuinely high one in practice. I had given her a spare key in month 4 because she often opened before I arrived from the wholesale market. That key lived on a labeled hook inside my back workroom. The spare key that my brother used to enter Wren and Soil the night before he drove through the front of it came from a different hook. It came from the hook beside my parents' back door, where I had left a copy 3 years earlier because I had believed, and I want to be careful about how I phrase this because the belief still embarrasses me, I believed that a spare key to a place you built was something you gave your family because family was the category of people who were supposed to be safe with it. The truck came through the window at approximately 2:40 in the morning on a Thursday in December. I know this because the security camera on the building across the street time-stamped the footage, which was recovered by a detective named Officer Reyes, and because Lyle had his own phone mounted to the dashboard and had started recording before he turned off the headlights. He had posted the footage by 3:15 a.m. I did not see it until 6:47 when Poppy called. I was in the car already about to leave for the market. She said my name first, and then she stopped, and then she said she was outside the shop and she needed me to come now, and the way she said it was the way voices get when the thing they are describing is not something you should be told while you are sitting in a parked car in your own driveway. But there is no other option. The front window was gone. The custom display shelf I had built with salvaged pine was in pieces across the front sidewalk. The ceramic vases, the ones the ceramicist had made on consignment, the ones that had been in the window since opening day, most of them were destroyed. The cooler unit was intact, because the truck had stopped when it hit the design table, which had been bolted to the floor, specifically because I had once worked in a shop where an unsecured table had shifted and damaged a refrigeration line, and I had not forgotten it. The video showed him getting out of the truck after impact and walking through the wreckage with his phone still recording. He was wearing a jacket I recognized. He had captioned the post with one word. The word was finally. I had heard that word from him before, in other contexts, and it had always carried a particular weight. It meant he had been waiting. It meant this was not an impulse. It meant he had thought about it long enough that doing it felt like a completion. I sat in my car outside what was left of the front of my shop and I did not cry. I called Officer Reyes, whose card I was handed within the hour by the first responding officer. Then, I called a woman named Harriet, who was a civil litigator I had met through an event client 3 years earlier. She was not a close contact. She was something more useful than a close contact. She picked up on the 3rd ring. I told her the window was gone, that my brother had driven through it, that he had filmed it, and that he had used a key my parents kept. There was a pause. Then she asked me to read her Section 8.4 of my commercial lease. I had spent 7 weeks reviewing my lease before signing it. I had hired a contracts attorney for 4 hours specifically because I had heard enough stories in the events industry about what commercial leases could and could not do to people who had not read them carefully. I had asked that attorney to draft several non-standard provisions. Section 8.4 was one of them. I had asked for it because I had read about a florist in another city who lost her shop, not to vandalism, but to someone who had been given access by a third party and caused damage that her insurance did not cover because of an access clause. I had read that story at 2 in the morning the week before I signed my lease, and I had called my attorney the next day and asked him to add language that established liability for any third party whose provision of access, explicit or implied, enabled damage to the premises. He had drafted it broadly. He had said, when he sent the final version, that I might never need it, but that it would hold. Harriet read it in less than 6 minutes. "Who has your spare key?" she asked. I told her. She said, "This clause establishes joint and several liability for any party who provided access or enabled access to be provided, directly or by failure to secure. It names third parties expressly." Then she said, "Tell me about your parents' property." I told her what I knew, which was not much. My parents owned a house at 44 Birchwood Lane, where they had lived for 19 years. She said she would look into the rest. The damage assessment came back at $61,400. That number covered the structural repair to the facade, the window replacement, the display shelving, the ceramic inventory lost on consignment, and this is the part that mattered to me as much as anything, it covered 4 weeks of Poppy's lost income. Because I had to close for 4 weeks and she had siblings to help support, and I was not going to let her absorb that. Lyle's attorney, a man named, it doesn't matter what his name was, called me 10 days after the filing. He was relaxed in the way people are relaxed when they have not yet read a document carefully. He went through his opening position in some detail. When he finished, I asked him to pull up section 8.4 of my lease and read it to me out loud. The silence had a specific texture. He said he would need to review the full documentation and get back to me. I said I would be here. What Harriet had found in 72 hours of research was this. My parents had taken out a home equity line of credit against 44 Birchwood Lane. The outstanding balance was substantial. The equity line had a covenant, a clause that most people never read and that most loan officers present as boilerplate, that stated any active civil liability claim exceeding $50,000 filed against the primary borrowers would trigger a mandatory balance review by the lender, a bank called Coastal Heritage. My claim was filed at $61,400. My parents were the parties who had provided access by holding and failing to secure the spare key. Harriet had filed against Lyle as the primary defendant and against my parents as joint parties under Section 8.4. Coastal Heritage received a copy of the filed claim 7 days after the filing. My father called me on a Saturday morning. He was not the version of himself I had grown up with. He told me I was making a mistake. He told me that Lyle had a problem and that the family needed to address it together. He told me that the house was not the point. I told him that the shop was not an abstraction. I had built it. I had put the bolt holes in the floor and painted the exterior green and hung the sign, and sourced the ceramics and built the cooler system and employed a person who depended on it. It existed. It had been real. He said Lyle had always struggled and that I had always been the one who landed on her feet. I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, "The footage is time-stamped. The caption is one word. That is not a struggle. That is a decision." I told him I loved him and that I was not withdrawing the claim. He said some other things. I heard them. My mother did not call me herself. She had my brother's girlfriend call, a woman named It Still Doesn't Matter, who delivered the message that my mother was devastated and that pulling the parents into a legal matter over what was essentially a family dispute was going to cause damage that couldn't be repaired. I thought about that phrase, a family dispute. Then Lyle called. It was the first time I had heard his voice since the filing. He sounded different from how he usually sounded. The version of him I had always known had a particular ease, a looseness that came from having operated for most of his adult life without serious consequence. That ease was gone. He said he had not meant for it to go this far. I asked him what he had meant when he captioned it finally. He didn't answer that. He said if our parents lost access to the equity line, they would not be able to cover several things that were currently depending on it. He said this as though it were information I did not already understand. I asked him to tell me something. I asked him if he remembered the Tuesday in October when he had come to my shop with the folder and the printouts. He said yes. I asked him if he remembered what he said about the lot next door and my delivery access. He didn't answer. I told him that I had spent 11 weeks building something and 22 months growing it, and that I had made no claim on anyone else's money or time or credit to do it, and that he had gotten into a truck with a key that was not his and driven it through the front of what I had built and recorded it and posted it online, and the word he had chosen meant he had been planning it, and I was not going to pretend that that was an accident or a struggle or a family dispute. I told him I had to go because Poppy needed her pay stub processed for the week. I ended the call. Coastal Heritage completed their review in 31 days. They did not accelerate the full balance. That required a final judgment rather than a filed claim. But they required my parents to post $33,000 in additional collateral within 60 days or accept a refinance at a rate that was considerably worse than the one they currently had. My parents did not have $33,000 liquid. They had been carrying Lyle's expenses for years out of a line of credit secured by the house they had lived in for 19 years, and there was nothing left in reserve. The settlement was reached without going to trial. Lyle's attorney had by that point read Section 8.4 multiple times. The final figure was $54,000, payable over 18 months, with my parents co-obligated under a personal guarantee as joint parties. It was less than the assessed damage. Harriet explained that a negotiated settlement was preferable to the timeline and cost of trial. I agreed with her reasoning. I signed. Officer Reyes called me the following week. Criminal charges had been filed. The dashboard footage, time-stamped, with Lyle's face visible and the caption attached to the public post, had been submitted as primary evidence. Lyle received a conditional discharge and 210 hours of community service. His license was suspended for 8 months, which meant the truck that had been bought for him was, for most of a year, sitting in a driveway. I reopened Ren and Soil on a Monday morning in late February. Poppy had repainted the window lettering over the weekend. She had come in without being asked. She had also, without asking, placed a small bundle of dried straw flowers on the repaired display shelf. Just one bundle, in the corner, the way she sometimes did when she wanted to mark something without making a production of it. My friend Suki came at 8 in the morning with a thermos of coffee and sat at the design table with me while I worked through the first order of the day, a sympathy arrangement for a regular client, white and cream, nothing dramatic. We did not discuss the previous 4 months. We talked about the new ceramic supplier I had found while the shop was closed, a woman in the hill towns, 2 hours north, who made pieces with a weight and texture I had not found anywhere else. Suki held one of the prototype vases and said she thought it was right. I thought so too. My parents have my phone number. I have not changed it. Neither of us has called the other since the settlement documents were executed. We share a city. We share, in some abstract sense, a history. What we no longer share is the particular story we were each telling ourselves about what the other one owed. Lyle deleted the post. The video had been downloaded and re-uploaded in 14 places before he did. Ren and Soil is open 5 days a week plus Sunday mornings for the farmers market. Last month was the highest revenue month since we opened. Poppy got a raise. The new ceramics are in the window and they catch the morning light in a way that the original pieces never quite did, which I did not expect and which I think about sometimes. There is a version of this story where the right response was to absorb it quietly, to treat the destruction of something I built with my own hands as the price of keeping a peace that was never actually peaceful, where the right response was to accept that some people have learned they will not be held to account and to become one more piece of evidence confirming that belief. I didn't do that. The question I find myself returning to is not whether I handled it correctly, though I believe I did. It is this. How long had the word finally been sitting there, and what does it mean that nobody thought to ask about it until the truck was already through the window? I don't have a clean answer to that. I'm not sure I'm supposed to. I have thought about the word finally a lot since all of this ended. Not the damage, not the settlement. Not the 4 weeks the shop was closed while Poppy and I figured out how to keep moving. I've thought about that one word because it tells you something that no legal clause and no community service hours can fully address. It tells you that the person who did the thing had been sitting with the idea of doing it for a long time. It wasn't a bad night. It wasn't a reaction. It was a plan that had been waiting for the right moment, and the right moment turned out to be a Tuesday in December at 2:40 in the morning with a truck and a key that wasn't his. I think about what it takes to build something from scratch, not the money, though the money is real and it takes real time and real discipline. I mean the other part, the part where you decide at some point that you are going to figure out the things you don't know yet. I had never installed subway tile before I did it on my knees over a 3-day weekend with a YouTube tutorial. I had never negotiated a commercial lease before I spent 7 weeks doing it with a contracts attorney I paid out of my savings. I had never run a business before I ran one, Every single part of Renan soil was built on a decision to learn something I didn't know and to keep going past the point where it would have been easier to stop. That is not a special quality. It is just what building something actually requires. What I understand now, looking back, is that Lyle had watched that process from a distance for 2 years and arrived at a conclusion that had nothing to do with what I had actually done. He had decided that what I had was a version of what he deserved, and that the gap between what he had and what I had was something that had been done to him, rather than something that had been done to him, rather than something that had accumulated over years of different choices. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because I think that particular confusion, the one where someone else's effort reads to you as an injury, is one of the more destructive things a person can carry around, and I watched it in my brother for years without ever naming it clearly. And eventually it drove a truck through my window. The intellectual part of this, the part I'm most grateful for, was the lease. Not because it gave me leverage, though it did, because it forced me to think carefully, 2 years before any of this happened, about accountability and where it should flow. I asked my attorney to write that clause because I had read about someone else's loss and I had decided to think seriously about it instead of moving on. That decision, made at 2 in the morning before I had even signed the lease, was the decision that made everything else possible. Thinking carefully in advance is not glamorous. It doesn't feel like strength in the moment. It feels like paperwork, but it is one of the most honest forms of self-respect there is. Poppy got a raise when we reopened. That mattered to me more than almost anything else in this entire story. She had shown up on the worst morning, stayed through the hardest weeks, repainted the window lettering on her own time, and placed a bundle of dried flowers on the shelf without making a production of it. She had kept her integrity completely intact through something that was not her situation to navigate. That is not a small thing. That is the kind of person you hold on to when you find them. The shop is open. The new ceramics are in the window. I did not become someone who absorbs destruction quietly in order to preserve a peace that was costing me more than I ever acknowledged. I don't know if I would do everything exactly the same way, but I know this. The only version of this story where I lose is the one where I decide that what I built doesn't deserve to be defended. I never once believed that. And I think that belief, that what you make with your own hands and your own discipline is worth protecting, is something worth carrying forward, carefully, into everything you build next.